We figured out what we're having for dinner tomorrow night.
We figured out that we don't cook on Fridays. Who cooks on Fridays? True.
Yeah, my impulse usually, I mean, I like to cook. I like to cook, but on Fridays I'm usually like, let's just go out somewhere. Like Friday just feels like a good night to have someone else clean and cook and all that. But I do like to cook. We find my wife is more. Actually, my wife is more the cook, like the whack-a-mole, throw things together. I actually enjoy baking more. I think that's because I'm more of a kind of a science kind of geek. Like I like following, and and baking is more about interactions, and you've got to get things precise. And it's so like the breads and the pies and the things are mine, and the everything. I make a pretty good pie, I have to admit. So, and it is getting to be apple season soon, so even better. Made it, thank you. How was open house?
It was pretty good.
Yeah.
Fast.
Vast?
Fast.
Oh, fast. Yeah. Yeah, usually on those things, on those nights, like for us, we get like 8 minutes or 10 minutes or something. And you feel like, and what's worse for us is that where I'm located is at the far end of the school. Our music facility is like, so like by the time the parents find their way down to where we are, we're like, hi, my name is so-and-so, good to have your kids in class, and that's all the time we have tonight. So get in touch with me if you have questions. And then they've got to run on to their next classes. So sometimes it does feel a little ridiculous, but yeah. All right, so anyways, we're just about to kind of discuss the reading from last week. They were just meeting in small groups about this. So first thing, sort of takeaways. Why don't we start with the segmentation part of it? So, like, what's the big idea of segmentation? Why do they bother taking a whole chapter of this book to write about this? What were the main takeaways?
Just breaking things into smaller parts.
Okay.
And there was a specific sentence that I saw that says when the material is complex, you can't make it simpler by leaving out some of the elements or steps just because that would destroy the accuracy of the lesson. So I like how it talks about like don't dumb things down just because it's a lot of material. Break it into smaller parts.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Anyone want to continue those thoughts? Add to those thoughts?
Well, I was just gonna say like for pre-training, like I recently transitioned to a new role. So like I was telling my teammates, discussion partners, my job is so good at training. So like I transitioned to the new role, and the first 10 days is like a completely just training onboarding packet, and like they give you time, even throughout like day-to-day basis, like they'll train you for 4 hours, and then they'll give you like 2-3 hours to like go out and do exactly what you just like got trained on, and then the next day you get trained on something different, and you go out and do like exactly what. And I thought it was just like a really good thing.
So yeah, so that's an example of segmentation, that they're not throwing everything at you and then saying, okay, now you're ready to go. It's like, here's a bit, practice it, see what you got, move on. Yeah. Okay. Anything from this side of the room, or they covered it all?
I mean, I kind of agree. Like segmentation is good, even if like in language arts, sometimes you're just doing things for a long time. Taking papers takes days. Same with social studies. So being able to break it up, even if you're doing the same task, but changing the groups you're in or the way you're doing something, and
sure.
whether you're discussing or not, even if it's a similar type of thinking, can be really helpful. And I also I push back against it just a little bit in terms of I think there's a value in being able to tell a kid go write for 45 minutes. And I consciously work towards building students' reading and writing endurance throughout the year. At the beginning of the year, it might be 10 minutes maximum. By the end, I can expect to say, all right, go write, and not saying anything else for the class, like for the rest of the class, except to individuals as I go around. So I think it's what kids need, but I also think we kind of want to challenge them to put things together on their own. Kind of,
Sure.
We differentiate it and we scaffold it to make it easy for them to show that they can eventually.
Yeah. And the chapter, I think, doesn't necessarily disagree with what you just said, because I think one of their main points is one of the reasons to segment is because of complexity of the task, not necessarily the length of the task. So asking someone to write for 45 minutes, I think they would say, well, that's that's okay. That's not. I mean, it is a complex task, but it's a linear task where they're basically involved with one thing for an extended time. And my feeling on this is that they're looking more at when you have a task that has many pieces to it, trying to break those up in a way so that we can kind of process each piece of it at a time. So I think they're still basically compatible. But yeah, I mean, especially with all of the sort of ADD attention and everything, like it would be good for students to be able to sit still and actually focus on something for a while. I think honestly, for me, one of my best lessons growing up, I was raised Quaker. I don't know if you guys even know anything about Quakerism. I grew up in Pennsylvania, but essentially our meetings are silent. So our services each week are basically an hour of silence. If people feel moved to speak, they stand up and speak. Well, you can imagine being a young kid and having to go in there and sit for an hour quietly once a week and how hard that is. And yes, I would start counting the seconds and then counting the minutes. And there was, of course, no clock or anything you could see. So it was just kind of like, but I do think that like having those kinds of experiences to realize that you can just do nothing or focus on one thing for an extended time is something that's maybe slightly lost these days. Yeah, and then what about the pre-training? And what is sort of the main idea of the pre-training concept?
Kind of to be able, I think, right, to be able to introduce vocabulary or terms, especially, or just like concepts that would be needed, or that would you would need to know in order to complete a task, or in order to understand the instructions that were to come.
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
with the car example, and knowing all the pistons and the terminology of the interior
Before you can
parts of
start
the car.
talking about
Yeah.
how it functions. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of self-defines itself, right? Pre-training. You're training things before you do the actual lesson. So yeah, and the reason I bring these two up is to relate them mainly to our Moodles. We're still in the design phase, the first D of the ADDIE thing with our Moodles. And this is going to be the next thing for you to think about is segmenting and pre-training. So maybe specifically related to Moodle, or since we're using instructional technology, where do you think these two concepts come into play when you're talking specifically about instructional technology? Either one of them. We don't have to take them in order. So why or how or for what reason would you apply segmenting to instructional technology and or pre-training? Pre-training might actually be the easier one. Instructional technology. You're asking your students to use a Moodle to take a class.
Well, you need to teach them how to actually use it.
Right, okay? And this is probably the biggest thing that comes into play with educational technology. I mean, to a lesser extent, other situations, but technology by its nature usually requires a certain amount of training for people just to know how to do what they need to do. I mean, I had a lab at my school for music, and it was all Macintosh computers. Well, I knew that probably the majority of my students were more used to using Windows computers. So I would have to take part of a lesson to just show them, here's where the on button is. When it turns on, here's how you log in. If you want to shut this computer down, you don't go to a start menu, you go to the Apple, like those sorts of things. And they had nothing to do with the course content, but I knew that for my students to do what they were going to need to do in the class, these were skills that they needed to have first. And it gets even more important when you're dealing with an environment like Moodle, if you're expecting your students to interact with the Moodle outside of your guidance, like not in your classroom, but go home and do this thing. Because now they're not even going to have you there as a resource. If you're in a typical class and a student doesn't know a term that they needed to know, you can kind of immediately on the spot kind of stop and get them caught up on that term and address that issue. If you're turning them loose in an online environment to do learning and you're not there, So you need to give a little bit of thought, or a little bit more thought maybe, to structuring some of that in. So you might want to think on something like a Moodle to put in a quick video at the beginning that they can just click on, that even just gives them an overview of, here's how the material is going to be presented, and here are the kinds of things you're going to need to do, and here's what you need to go through. So kind of giving some thought to that. So the pre-training concept, typically with technology, educational technology, is about the technology itself. I mean, yes, if there's pre-training you need to do with your content, then do that too. And maybe that's a section in your Moodle, or maybe that's right at the top of your Moodle. You have a glossary that you want the students to go through first, just so that they understand the concepts that they're going to need in the class. Or maybe you throw a quick quiz out there that lets you see whether they know the things that they're going to need to know in order to do the class. So there's some different ways you can approach it. So that's going to be something to think about as you start to develop your Moodle. And then the segmenting, and as you've seen in Moodle, segmenting is kind of one of the core pieces of building a Moodle. You've got whatever you want to call them, lessons, units, weeks, topics. That's the way they structure the Moodle. So for your own topic, whatever it is you're covering, you're going to want to think about, how do you want to divide the material up? You've got your instructional goals in place. You know what you want your students to be able to do by the end. How now are you going to divide up? And again, in a technology environment, you have to give a little more thought to it, because that is how the students are going to interact with it. Again, you may not be there to help overcome or approach things from a different way. They're just going to have what's in front of them. So you want to think about what's going to make the most sense in terms of how I organize this. Even titling the sections or titling the topics can make a big difference. What sequence they go in, how much material you plan on putting in each one. So for next week, you're going to be extending the instructional design plans that you started last week. Last week you made it through, I think, question 7. For this week, there's an additional, I think, 4 questions that are 8 through 11. And 3 of those 4 are going to be about segmenting and about pre-training. So now that you kind of know what your topic is, and you've got your goals in mind, and you know what problem you're addressing, now in the design phase, we're going to move into, okay, well, how is this actually going to look? What do my students need to know before they can do this successfully? How am I going to divide up the material on my Moodle? And questions like that. So that's going to be the main focus of this week. So that's why I wanted you to read that chapter last week, to get you thinking about these things, and just to be aware that especially in an online teaching environment, you've got to pay attention to these almost more than in a standard classroom, because you won't be there to hold the student's hand while they're going through it. All right. So questions about that, comments on that? That make logical sense in terms of where it fits into the puzzle. So I may as well right now, while we're here and thinking about it, I mean, so we already looked at the first piece of homework for next week, and this is the other piece, which is what I was just talking about. So it's set up as another forum. That's how the post is going to be. But this is your instructional design part 2. So go back to the same document, whatever document you created for last week in Word where you were doing your answers. That's going to become kind of your master document. So go back there and just copy and paste in these 4 additional pieces for the design piece. So that's 8 through 11. And then just like you did last week, just replace my questions with your answers. So these become the headings, and then you answer. So it's segmentation. What is your plan for dividing up? How does your plan for segmentation support your learners' ability to comprehend the material on their own and direct their own instruction? And then kind of based off of that, what are your actual sections going to be in your Moodle? Your segmentation and your sections might line up, but you might have a couple of segments within one section if you think that's the best way to do it, if there's 2 things that are linked. So this question is about how your Moodle will actually be structured. What are the actual header sections that you're going to use? Give just a quick description of each section. Then question 10 is just about pre-training. Are you going to be using pre-training? If so, how? probably some form of yes, I'm going to use pre-training. Whether that's, again, about using the Moodle, if you're setting this up so that you're anticipating your students would use this without you around, then your pre-training may be more about them using the Moodle. Or if you're planning on using, like we were discussing, where you're the teacher using the Moodle just to organize your materials, then what kind of pre-training for your students would you build in that would be part of your instruction? And then coming out of all of that is just kind of giving maybe a listing out of Moodle activities. Now I know we haven't certainly gone through all the Moodle activities. I don't know if any of you spent some time over the last week just poking around in Moodle. We're going to take a look. We've already looked at assignment. You guys have already done a Moodle assignment. We've already done forums. You've already seen pages and URLs and file pages. You've already seen, oh no, we haven't done that one yet. What we're going to look at tonight, we're going to be doing a database activity. So you're going to see how that works. And then there's maybe 3 or 4 additional activities that we'll look at over the next few weeks. But for now, kind of just go into your Moodle, pull up that list of activities, and just kind of look through. A lot of them are self-explanatory, but if you want to just try some of them out, and then think about, now that you've got your plan together, what kinds of things. I'm not going to hold you to this. If you say you're going to use a database and you don't end up using it in your Moodle, that's fine. But at this point, just start thinking now about the content and what the content's going to look like once you have the sections. So you'll answer these questions in the plan. Then in the forum, and some people did this different ways last week, so I probably just wasn't clear enough. Some people attached their Word document to the forum post, which is fine. It just means that somebody has to click on that link and download it and open it up to see what you posted. So what I'd rather you do is, for this week, just copy the new questions and your answers, and then just paste those right into your forum post. And that's really all you have to do. You don't even need to comment on it. All you have to do is paste what you answered. And then that way people can go right in and can see what you're thinking and make suggestions or comments or things like that. If you didn't do that for last week, don't worry. It's fine. But as we go forward, if we're doing things like this, just put the text right in. But because you've done it in a Word document already, that should cut down on the amount of typing you have to do while you're there. All right. So does that assignment make sense? Any questions? We're good? Okay. We're just rolling tonight. So honestly, that's really the work for next week. We've already covered it. So it's doing the initial look at the technology integration plans and working on that document, and then continuing with your Moodle ID plans. There is one more thing. Once you have your sections in the homework, it does say actually go into your Moodle and start actually organizing the sections and naming them and putting in a brief description for each section. But that's really going to be the scope of the work for the coming week, so hopefully not too onerous. Okay. All right. So the next thing is graphic design. So as I said the first week, structurally for this course, in terms of creating content, there are kind of mini units that basically will spread across 3 weeks of the class. So we're going to do a mini unit on graphics and graphic design. We're going to do a mini unit on audio, things like podcasts and so on. We're going to do a mini unit on video. We're going to do a mini unit on Web 2.0 integration, integrating web apps. We're going to do a mini unit on assessment. So over the 3 weeks, generally my plan is on the first week, it's going to be about sort of talking about that thing. And again, not so much from the perspective of, I'm going to teach you how to use Photoshop, right? It's more going to be underlying when you're creating graphics is this thing called the Gestalt principle. And if you understand that, then regardless of what specific piece of software you're using or what kind of graphic you're creating, these will be applicable no matter what specific technology you're using. So my hope is that whatever you're comfortable with or whatever you're using at the given moment, whether it's just doing something in Word and using its graphic, or you're actually using something like Photoshop or InDesign, these principles will still hold true and will still help you make better, more effective instructional graphics. So that's kind of my approach, is not so much about the nuts and bolts of using a piece of software, but giving you guidance that will help let you make better materials. So week 1 will be about that introduction level. Week 2 will then usually be about actually doing it. So if we're here in class, I'd be giving you some lab time to just work on creating a graphic or working on a video or whatever. And then by the 3rd week, the expectation is that you would have created something in that mode for your Moodle and incorporated it into your Moodle to be assessed as such. So for graphics, we'll go over Gestalt this week. Next week, we're not meeting next week, but next week you will be working on actually creating a graphic. And then by the following week, that graphic will be incorporated into your Moodle. And then if you need other graphics, you can make those as well, but there will be at least one on your Moodle. And then we'll be starting the next one, which I think the next one we're going to look at is audio. So we'll do a week of looking at some audio principles. The following week, we will look at actually doing a project where you're creating something audio-based. And then the following week, you'll have incorporated that. So that's one of the threads over the next couple of months. All right. So tonight is about the theory. So does anybody know what the word Gestalt means? It does show up in other contexts. So it's not unheard of, but no? Okay, that's fine. So the first step in this is I have a reading. It's not really a chapter reading. It's something I assembled from a bunch of different resources. But just to kind of give you an overview of what it is, why it applies to graphic design, and why it applies specifically to instructional design. And then there's sort of laws related to Gestalt. Gestalt is a principle, and then there are laws that feed off of that principle. And there's 5 laws contained in this overview. So first step 1 is going to be to have everybody just kind of look at the overview and get an initial idea. Step 2 is we're going to use a database activity, and each of you is going to do a quick database entry where you're going to pick one of the 5 laws and talk a little bit about it. And then I've got 3 instructional graphics that you're going to look at, and you're going to look at those graphics through the lens of whichever law you're working from. And then you're going to kind of vote which of the 3 is the best and the worst according to your law, and then talk a little bit about sort of how you came up with that decision and how either the use or the misuse of the law you're looking at affected the design examples. So that's kind of the scope. So step 1 is just to kind of read through this. So I'll go over the details of the database. So start by just taking a few minutes. It's 6 pages, but it's not really that long because a good portion of it is taken up with some visual examples. So just kind of read through this and get a sense of what it means, and then we'll look at the database activity. All right, how are we doing with the reading? Everyone still going? Everyone's done? Done. Okay. All right, so I don't want to go into too much detail on any of this because that's part of the next activity, but just to kind of point out a couple of key ideas. On the first page, this middle column really is the one that applies most specifically to instructional design. And I like where it talks about pictures are information. Anything visual is information. And this is oftentimes what our students are using to try to get information into their own brains. So we need to make sure that whatever they're looking at, if they are looking at something that is graphic in nature, and that could simply be a page full of text. I mean, that is still a graphic, even if it doesn't have any shapes or anything on it. It is still something they are going to process graphically, visually, is to make sure that we're working with the way that their brains work so that they can access the information as efficiently and as effectively as possible. So the main point of Gestalt is that before anybody looks at any specific thing on a page, they get a picture of the whole thing all at once. That's what Gestalt really means. Gestalt means an overview, a big picture look at something. So this is just the way the brain works. Before we get obsessed with details, we look at what the big picture is. So when you give a handout to students, or they go to a web page that you've designed, or to your Moodle, or to a magazine article, before they've accessed any of the specific information on the page, the way that the whole page looks or the whole graphic looks is going to already set the stage for how well they can access the information on that page. So this is the underlying concept. So if you're creating a handout for your students, or if you're making a drawing for your students, or you're designing a web page for your students, keeping these principles in mind as you do so, regardless of what program you're using, is going to help the students' experience improve because they will be able to get what's on the page easier and more efficiently, right? So that's the point of this whole approach. So within that, you saw there were 5. There are actually additional principles or laws that show up depending on which specific Gestalt you're looking at. So I selected these 5 because they're sort of the 5 ones that are common across whichever version you're looking at. And that was proximity, similarity, continuity, figure and ground, and closure are the 5. So what I would like you to do now, and now that we have 6 in the room, it's a little bit not as clean, but that's totally okay, is in the database activity. Basically, the database activity, to take a step back, this is a really great way if you're using a Moodle with students and you want them to be able to create content that then everybody can access. Essentially, it allows them to create like a quick encyclopedia. So you could have a group of students and you want them to each look up information about an animal, and they can then create a database entry about that animal. You as the teacher get to set up what information they have to include, whether that's texts, visuals, they can upload photos, they can upload other multimedia. So you kind of get to structure what the entry looks like and what information needs to be there. And then your students can add their own entries. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do on this activity is the first thing you're going to be asked to do is to prepare a brief overview of whichever Gestalt law you're going to be working with. And we'll get to that in just a second. So obviously everybody will have one, and one of the Gestalt principles will have 2 people working on it. That's fine. So just a quick overview. You know, continuity is when blah, 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 blah. Okay? Then, in addition, with the readings that you just did and the examples that were in the reading, I've supplied 3 instructional graphics, and these are things I pulled off the internet from situations where people were intending these graphics to be used instructionally. So they are not just random examples. These are things that were supposed to be instructional in nature. And through the lens of whichever law you're dealing with, I want you to kind of assess the 3 and you're going to determine of the three which one you think is the best example of your particular law and which one is the worst. Now, I'm not saying that any of these three examples are going to be stellar examples, so you may have to be kind of picking the best of the worst in some cases, but try to figure out if you were to use one of these three as sort of the best case example of your particular law. And for those, it's going to be 2 quick check boxes. So which is the best, you check off which of the three, which is the worst, you check off which of the three. And then the final part of your entry will be an explanation of that. Why did you pick the best as the best and the worst as the worst? And also sort of how did your law impact that particular graphic? So if they used it well, how did using it well make the graphic better for the students? If they didn't use the law well, how did not using the law well impact the student's experience? All right? So that's going to be your entry, is a text box that's a brief overview of your law, name the law, and then give a brief overview. Then you're going to vote, put in your decision on which of the three is the best and the worst. And then you're going to give a description sort of why you picked that and how the law impacted the educational value of that graphic. Okay, that makes sense? All right, so I know we'll have 2 people working on one, but this is an individual thing. So you're each going to work individually, so whoever ends up being the 2 will just have 2 entries for the same topic. And it'll be interesting to see whether the 2 people come up with the same conclusion about which one's the best and the worst. You never know. All right, so for what you will do when you come into this is you're going to be clicking on Add an Entry. That will start your entry. And the links for the graphics are here. So who's doing what? It doesn't really matter as long as we get at least one person on each. Is there somebody who wants to do similarity? I could also do. Okay, so we got a similarity, proximity. All right, I got 2 hands, so why don't we'll have that be the one where 2 people are doing it. So we've got closure, continuity, and figure and ground between the remaining 3. Do we have a cage match on who gets which, or anybody want to grab one of them? What's that?
You can surprise me.
Okay, so why don't you take closure then, and why don't you do continuity and figure and ground? Okay, so yeah, so this will be the portion. I mean, we still have 50 minutes left to class. So take your time on doing the assessment and on kind of really thinking it through, especially on your reflective piece. I am going to ask everybody to kind of quickly present their findings. Doesn't have to be a full-blown presentation, but summarize for the class what you came up with, and we'll see which images did better and worse. But we've got time, so at any point in this stretch of time, if you feel like you need to take a 5-minute break, whatever, feel free to do so. But we'll take probably at least a half an hour or so to go through this, unless it looks like everybody is finished, in which case we'll move on. But do take your time. Really kind of think about how each of these principles applies to actual images